Beneath an overpass forgotten by the city, a millionaire wandered slowly through the night, lost in numbers that no longer made him feel successful. But everything changed with a single whispered sentence from a little black girl. "I need milk for my baby brother." That one moment turned his entire life in a direction no one could have predicted. The story begins there with an innocent promise and unravels into a hidden world of corruption buried behind crumbling walls of law. This isn't just a touching moment, it's a real-life story you won't be able to look away from. So, tell me, what time of day are you watching this, and where in the world are you tuning in from? Share below, and don't forget to leave a like if you believe kindness still has the power to bring justice. Thomas Rivera, the founder of a $200 million tech empire, wandered aimlessly through the maze-like streets of the city's financial district. It was just after 9 o'clock in the evening, a time when most office workers had long since gone home, and the city began to exhale its weekday fatigue. Streetlights glowed steadily, casting warm halos onto the cool pavement. Steam rose in gentle wisps from a nearby manhole cover. A half-crushed coffee cup rolled lazily down the curb, nudged by the wind. Thomas moved slowly, hands tucked in the pockets of his tailored overcoat, his steps heavy with exhaustion, his mind still churning with unresolved projections and financial forecasts. At 45, he had built everything from nothing. His discipline was legendary, his control absolute. But tonight, numbers that usually obeyed him refused to align. Spreadsheets and projections twisted in his head like static. His latest venture, another high-stakes investment, had left him more frustrated than inspired. The balance sheets mocked him. His success, once a source of pride, now sat hollow in his chest. The crisp autumn air bit at his skin, but did nothing to clear his thoughts. That was when he heard it. A voice, small but composed, cut cleanly through the stillness. "Sir, please, I just need some milk for my little brother. I promise I'll pay you when I grow up." He stopped. The words hung in the air for a moment surreal. He turned slowly, scanning the shadows near a dimly lit convenience store. There, standing barely within the light, was a little girl, 6 years old, maybe 7. Her clothes were thin and worn, her coat far too big, and unzipped at the collar. In her arms, she cradled an infant wrapped tightly in a faded blanket. The baby stirred slightly, a soft sigh escaping from its small mouth. The girl's eyes were wide and alert, not desperate, not pleading, just steady, determined. Thomas blinked, unsure if he was imagining the encounter, but she stood there unwavering. Her posture was calm, no trembling, no tears, the kind of composure that didn't come from comfort, but from necessity. She wasn't begging. She was offering a proposition. Her words echoed back in his mind. "I promise I'll pay you when I grow up." He stepped closer, instinctively lowering himself to her level, trying not to intimidate her. "What's your name?" "Hope," she said, her voice clear and small. She adjusted the baby in her arms gently. "And this is Kevin. Our mother is very sick and can't go out." Thomas looked around. The street was quiet but not deserted. A trash bin overflowed nearby. A few cars rolled by in the distance. It was still early enough for safety, but late enough to question why a child was out here alone. A strange weight settled in his chest, part dread, part awe. He glanced toward the convenience store. Its windows glowed faintly under flickering fluorescent lights. With a nod, he gestured, "Come, let's get what you need." The three of them stepped into the store, the glass door jingling softly as it closed behind them. The warmth inside was stale but welcome. Shelves were half-stocked, the floor scuffed with wear. The cashier slumped behind the counter, barely looked up. Hope moved quietly beside him, her gaze fixed on the refrigerator section. Thomas reached in and took a carton of milk. The cashier rang it up. $3.50, the man muttered. Thomas stared at the number on the screen. It felt ridiculous. He negotiated deals worth millions, yet hadn't known the price of milk. There was something almost shameful about that. Without a word, he added a pack of diapers, some formula, a few jars of baby food, and then on impulse, a bag of fresh fruit. Hope's eyes followed every item. Her expression didn't change, but her fingers clutched Kevin more tightly. "That's too much, sir," she whispered, her brows drawn in worry. "I can't pay for all that." Thomas looked down at her. Something cracked open in him, quiet and irreversible. "Consider it a long-term investment," he said, offering a small smile as he handed her the bags. They walked together down the street, their footsteps echoing against the buildings. Neither spoke. Hope walked carefully, balancing the baby and the groceries with practiced ease. It struck him how natural this looked for her, as though she'd done it many times before. They passed shuttered storefronts and closed restaurants, each window reflecting their strange trio. After 2 blocks, she stopped. They stood before a dark, narrow alley between 2 brick buildings. A faint smell of damp concrete and rust lingered in the air. Hope turned to him. "This is it." "Thank you, sir." He hesitated, then offered his name. "Thomas. Thomas Rivera." She nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Thomas. When I grow up, I'll find you and pay you back every single penny." Before he could respond, she turned and disappeared into the alley, swallowed by the shadows. The only sound left was the distant hum of traffic and the soft rustle of leaves on the pavement. Thomas stood there for several moments, unmoving. Something about the encounter had unsettled him deeply. Her voice still echoed in his ears, her dignity, her composure. A child negotiating with the calm of a boardroom executive in circumstances that should have crushed her. He took a slow breath, glancing once more down the alley. Then, as though pulled by something stronger than thought, he followed, keeping his distance silent as his shoes crunched lightly against the gravel. Something told him this wasn't the end of the story, not for her and not for him. Hope led Thomas through an open lot strewn with debris and patches of cracked concrete, remnants of a forgotten corner of the city no one seemed interested in reclaiming. Overhead, the roar of passing cars echoed across a wide, elevated highway, the sound dull and distant, as if the world above was moving too fast to notice what lay beneath. The light was sparse, coming from a flickering street lamp half a block away. The air had a damp chill, heavy with the smell of mildew and engine grease. Thomas slowed his steps as they approached the spot Hope called home. Beneath the overpass, against a wall of cold stone, lay a young woman on a makeshift bed of flattened cardboard and old blankets. She was curled tightly, her body trembling despite the layers. Her forehead glistened with sweat. Her breathing came in shallow bursts, punctuated by quiet coughs. Kevin, the infant Thomas had seen cradled in Hope's arms, now lay beside her, swaddled in another threadbare wrap. It took Thomas a moment to fully grasp what he was seeing. A 6-year-old child acting as the sole caretaker for her baby brother and a clearly ill mother. A family exposed to the elements with nothing but each other. He stood still for several seconds, stunned. The ache he'd felt the night before now flared into something deeper, a quiet fury at a world that allowed this. Hope said nothing, only stood beside him, with the same calm composure, her arms crossed gently over her chest, waiting. The following morning, just as the first pale light of day broke through a veil of fog, Thomas returned. This time his arms were full, not just with groceries, but with medications carefully chosen based on symptoms he'd recognized. He had called a doctor friend for advice at dawn. Hope was already there waiting. When she saw him coming, a wide, brilliant smile lit up her face. It was the kind of smile children usually reserved for birthdays or holidays, the kind that said she hadn't been sure he'd return, but had hoped with everything in her. "I knew you would come back," she said, stepping forward to help him carry the bags. "Mom wants to meet the person who helped us." Thomas followed her to the same corner of the overpass. The young woman sat up slowly, eyes watchful. She was young, maybe 24, maybe younger, with dark skin, tangled hair, and the unmistakable look of someone who had been failed by far too many systems. Her name, he would learn, was Fiona. Her gaze met his with caution, not gratitude. Not yet. Fiona said nothing at first. She didn't smile. Thomas knew better than to expect it. She studied him in silence, assessing. He didn't step too close. He kept his voice gentle. "I'm Thomas Rivera," he said simply. "Hope said you were sick. I brought some medicine and food." Still, she said nothing. Her arms instinctively curled around Kevin, pulling him closer. Her body, frail from illness and exhaustion, tensed as though bracing for something. Finally, her voice emerged quiet, but edged with a tired defiance. "Why?" He didn't pretend not to understand. "Because no one should be left like this. Not you. Not your children." There was a long pause. Fiona exhaled slowly, eyes still wary. "We lost our apartment 3 months ago," she said. Her voice was rough, and her words came slowly, as though each one required effort. The landlord said he was clearing the building of undesirable tenants, people like me, single mothers, black, no steady income. Thomas felt his stomach tighten. "Did you try to get help, welfare, housing services?" "We tried," she replied, voice thinner now. But there were always issues, missing forms, delayed applications. It's like the system is built to make us disappear. Thomas nodded silently. He didn't press. He had heard enough. Enough to understand that this family hadn't fallen through the cracks. They had been pushed. In the weeks that followed, a quiet rhythm developed. Thomas made a habit of arriving each morning, sometimes with food, sometimes with supplies, sometimes with nothing more than his time, and every time Hope would be waiting. She began to share things with him, bits and pieces of her day. She would show him the things she found nearby, a broken toy, a rusted coin, a damaged book she had rescued from a recycling bin. "Can you read, Hope?" he asked her one morning, noticing the way she traced her fingers over the damp pages. "A little," she said proudly. "Mom taught me before she got sick." After that, Thomas began bringing children's books, stories with bright pictures and simple words. Hope devoured them. She would sit cross-legged beside Kevin and read aloud, her small voice firm and clear, even though Kevin was too young to understand. It was her way of making the world feel less broken. And Thomas would watch something heavy blooming inside his chest, a grief that this girl, so intelligent, so determined, had been left to grow up in silence and neglect. One morning, as the sun broke through a rare gap in the clouds, she asked him a question. It was the kind of question no child should have to ask. "Mr. Thomas, why do you help us? Everyone else pretends we don't exist." The words hit him like a punch to the chest. He crouched down, slowly meeting her eyes. "Because you're a family," he said. "You take care of each other. You protect each other. You love each other. I have a lot of money, Hope, but I never really had that." She looked at him for a long time. Then her expression softened. "Then maybe we can be your family too." Her voice was quiet, but filled with something raw and precious. Hope didn't offer sentiment lightly. She didn't barter in pity. But in that moment, she gave Thomas Rivera the only thing she had left to give the possibility of belonging. He couldn't speak right away. The words wouldn't come. But in his chest, something cracked open and reformed. What Thomas didn't know was that while these small exchanges were building something sacred, someone else had been watching. Someone with a clipboard, a uniform, and a plan to clean up the area by any means necessary. A plan that would soon endanger everything Thomas was only just beginning to protect. While Hope sat cross-legged beside her baby brother Kevin, whispering improvised tales about brave princesses and talking animals, Thomas stood nearby quietly watching. The overpass hummed faintly with passing traffic overhead, but down here, beneath the concrete and steel time, seemed to move differently. A soft breeze stirred the scattered debris along the ground, rustling old newspapers and plastic wrappers. The early morning light slanted across the space, casting long shadows across the wall, where Fiona leaned silently, her expression tired but soft. Thomas studied the children. The bond between them was radiant, undeniable. Hope wasn't just entertaining Kevin, she was shielding him, creating a world with words that kept out the cold, the hunger, the constant threat of being pushed further into the margins. Her love for him was quiet but fierce, and in that moment, Thomas saw something extraordinary. He thought about how people like them, with so much heart and strength, could be made invisible to a world that measured value by titles and wealth. And he knew deep down that what he was about to uncover in the coming days would not just change how he saw them, it would shake everything he believed about fairness, about justice, and about the system he had once thought was impartial. 3 weeks later, Thomas woke abruptly, a heavy feeling lodged in his chest. Something was off. The air felt wrong. He dressed quickly and drove to the overpass without waiting for the sun to fully rise. The streets were still dim, the city not quite awake. When he arrived, his gut twisted. What he saw stopped him cold. 2 uniformed officers stood over the family's sleeping area, which was now a mess of soaked cardboard and torn blankets. One officer was holding a half-empty cooler, pouring ice water directly onto what little they had left. The other stood beside him, impassive. But the third officer was the one Thomas focused on. A large, broad-shouldered man with a cruel smile spread across his face. Officer Frank. He barked orders with theatrical cruelty, as if performing for an audience only he could see. Fiona was sitting up, clutching Kevin protectively to her chest. Both were drenched. Kevin let out a small, confused wail. Fiona looked feverish again, her arms trembling. Hope, soaking wet, scrambled on her hands and knees, trying to rescue the now destroyed books Thomas had given her. Her fingers shook as she scooped the pages into her lap, mud-streaked and falling apart. "I told you, bums don't stay in this area," Officer Frank shouted. His voice echoed under the concrete. "This is private property, and you're breaking the law." Fiona's voice cracked through the chill. "Please, officer, just a few more days. We're looking for a place." "Please." Frank laughed. It was a sound without joy, sharp and mocking. "A few days. You've had months. I should call child services right now and let them do what your sorry self clearly can't." Thomas watched, frozen with rage. Hope stood up, her clothes clinging to her small frame, her hands still full of torn paper. She looked up at Frank, who towered over her, and her voice, though trembling, rang out. "We are not bums," she said. "We're a family. We take care of each other." Frank crouched down slowly, a grin spreading across his face that chilled Thomas to the core. "You know what happens to kids who think they're smart? They end up far away from mommy, in places where they learn to shut up." Fiona pulled Hope back quickly, holding her close. Her eyes were wide with panic. She didn't have to imagine what Frank meant. She had likely heard stories, maybe lived part of one. Thomas could see it in her face, the bitter knowledge that for people like her, systems didn't protect. They hunted. Frank stood up, adjusted the gun belt on his hip. "Decent people don't live under bridges," he muttered. "And kids don't grow up here. Not if I can help it." Eventually, the officers walked off, leaving the family soaked and shaken. Thomas approached slowly. Hope was crouched again, trying to gather the destroyed books. This time, she was crying, truly crying. "They ruined everything, Mr. Thomas," she said, her voice thin and cracked. "Why would they do that?" Thomas knelt beside her, gently wiping her cheek with the back of his hand. "Because some people think they can get away with hurting those who can't fight back." Fiona spoke next. Her voice was quieter than ever. "Mr. Thomas, this happens twice a week. It's always the same officer. He says we're polluting the neighborhood. He threatens to take my kids. Can he do that?" She looked around, eyes filled with something close to hopelessness. "People like us. The system doesn't work for people like us. He has a badge. We have nothing." Thomas stared at her, a new resolve forming behind his eyes. "Fiona," he said firmly, "can I ask you some questions about Officer Frank and how you lost your apartment? Because I don't think you're the only ones this has happened to." Something shifted in his tone. Fiona looked up at him. She didn't speak, but she nodded slowly. For the first time in weeks, Thomas wasn't just helping. He was preparing for something much bigger. That afternoon, Thomas Rivera sat in his office high above the city, where the skyline stretched in soft gray lines against the fading daylight. The hum of business as usual, the clicking keyboard's distant chatter, and the muffled vibration of phones was drowned beneath a rising current of focused anger. Without hesitation, he canceled every meeting on his calendar. Boardroom presentations, investment calls, internal strategy sessions, none of it mattered now. His focus had shifted entirely. This was no longer a matter of business. This was personal. He picked up the phone and dialed the first number. It rang twice before Hillary Bernard answered. Her voice was clipped and clear, professional, even after hours. A civil rights attorney known for dismantling corrupt police departments with surgical precision, Hillary had built her reputation on cases no one else dared touch. Thomas trusted her for one reason: she didn't flinch from power. She challenged it. The second call was to Ben Carter, a private investigator with a background in exposing city-level corruption. He had worked quietly behind the scenes for decades, pulling apart the connections between money, real estate, and systemic abuse. Thomas described everything he had witnessed: Officer Frank's targeted cruelty, the threats against Fiona and the children, the harassment disguised as cleanup. When he finished, there was a brief silence on the line. "It's a known pattern," Ben said, his voice low and steady. "Cities earmarked for redevelopment often come with hidden agendas. Vulnerable families are pushed out to make way for upscale projects, and they use men like Officer Frank to do the dirty work." "Dirty work for who?" Thomas asked, his voice tighter now. "Crescent Bay Holdings," Ben replied. "They buy up land after it's been cleared of what they call undesirable elements. They pay bottom dollar once the residents have been scared off. Officer Frank gets bonuses for every family that voluntarily relocates. We've tracked at least 15 evictions in the last 6 months tied to his precinct." Thomas didn't speak right away. He sat still, absorbing the weight of it. Not just corruption, but a coordinated system profiting from pain. He had built his empire by understanding systems. Now he would dismantle one. Still, he kept up his routine at the overpass. He showed up each morning, though Hope no longer greeted him with her usual smile. Instead, she stood at a distance, her small hand giving a hesitant wave. Her light had dimmed, and that silence told him everything. One afternoon she approached while he was unpacking food from the back of his car. Her steps were slow. Her head was slightly down. "Mr. Thomas," she said softly, "Mom says we might have to leave town." He looked up sharply, his hands pausing mid-motion. "Why, sweetheart?" She glanced behind her before answering. "Because the man in the uniform said, if we don't go soon, he'll take me and Kevin to different homes, far away from Mom." Thomas felt a sharp cold sensation slice through him. For a moment, he didn't breathe. He crouched so that they were at eye level. "Hope, do you trust me?" She nodded slowly, her large eyes locked onto his. "Then believe me when I say this. No one is ever going to separate you from your family. Not as long as I'm here." Her brow furrowed. "How can you be sure?" His tone was calm, but the glint in his eyes told another story. "Because men like Officer Frank only bully people they think have no power. He's never come up against someone like me." Just then, Fiona walked up quietly. She had heard enough to know the subject. "Mr. Thomas," she said gently, "we don't want you risking anything because of us." Thomas stood, his voice steady. "Fiona, I have $200 million and a legal team that makes Officer Frank look like a schoolyard bully. This isn't about risk, it's about choice, and I'm choosing to fight." That night, the city outside Thomas's window shimmered in a quiet blur. He sat in his office phone pressed to his ear as Hillary Bernard called back with an update. Her voice was firm. "Thomas, we found something bigger. Officer Frank isn't just forcing families out. He's falsifying records. He's been using false documentation to justify removing children and placing them in private adoption agencies." Thomas didn't respond right away. He tightened his hand around the phone, knuckles pale. "How many children?" 12. "Over the last 2 years. Everyone from Black or Latino families." There was no outburst, no curse, just a stillness so sharp it bordered on dangerous. "This is no longer about harassment," he said. "This is trafficking. He's profiting off the destruction of families." "Yes," Hillary confirmed, "but with your support, we can build a federal case. I'll need 2 weeks, and I'll make sure Fiona and the children are protected by tomorrow." Thomas stood and walked toward the window. In the direction of the overpass, the city lights continued to blink, indifferent to the pain they concealed. But he saw it. He couldn't unsee it. They had threatened a family he had come to care about, deeply, not as a donor, not as a businessman, as something far more intimate. That night, as Fiona cradled Hope to sleep on a mattress of patched blankets and cardboard whispering lullabies under the growl of the highway, Thomas Rivera began preparing for war. Not a symbolic war, not one of public relations, but a calculated, well-funded, meticulously orchestrated dismantling of the system that allowed men like Officer Frank to operate unchecked. Because sometimes the powerful forget that some people don't fight back with fists. They fight back with subpoenas, investigations, and the full force of justice sharpened by rage. Officer Frank had gone too far. He had mistaken silence for weakness. But he was about to learn that he had picked the wrong child to intimidate, the wrong mother to threaten, and the absolute wrong man to underestimate. The lion was no longer sleeping. He was awake and watching. The next morning, Thomas Rivera awoke with a strange and unfamiliar stillness. It wasn't peace exactly, but something heavier, a purposeful calm that seemed to settle deep in his chest. He stood at the wide windows of his penthouse coffee, warming his hand, and watched the city begin to stir below. But his mind wasn't on quarterly projections or the global markets. This morning, his attention was riveted to something far more pressing, far more personal, dismantling the lives of those who had profited from the suffering of children. At exactly 7 o'clock, Hillary Bernard arrived at his office, punctual and composed. She carried 3 thick legal folders, their weight slapping softly against her coat as she crossed the room. She spread the documents out on Thomas's polished mahogany table without preamble. "We got more than we expected," she said, her tone taut with restrained fury. "Frank wasn't just corrupt, he was careless. He left digital footprints all over the department network." Ben Carter walked in moments later holding a small black case of recording equipment. His expression was grim, but satisfied. "The cameras we placed around the overpass," he said, "recorded Frank making direct threats to at least 8 different families. But that's just the start." Thomas leaned back in his chair, his fingers' steepled eyes steady. "I'm listening." Hillary let out a dry laugh. Frank uses a secure group chat with other officers. They literally place bets on how many families they can clean up by the end of each week. We've got the screenshots, every vile message. They refer to children as premium products. Ben added, we traced payment trails to at least 2 private adoption agencies. High-income clients pay more for infants. Hope and Kevin were next on their list. A cold knot twisted in Thomas's gut. He gripped the arms of his chair to steady himself. This wasn't just systematic neglect, it was organized trafficking, government-sanctioned cruelty. How much do we have? He asked, voice low. Enough to take down the entire precinct, Ben replied. But I remember you said you wanted something more personal. Thomas's eyes narrowed. Exactly. Frank needs to learn what happens when he targets the wrong people. Later that afternoon, while Thomas and his team coordinated the final legal strike, Officer Frank returned to the overpass. But this time, he wasn't alone. A woman Thomas hadn't seen before stood beside him, Susan Wallace, a social worker with a soft face and hardened purpose. She stepped forward with a patronizing smile. Mrs. Fiona, I'm Susan Wallace from Child Protective Services. We've received reports of potential neglect. Fiona clutched Kevin tighter, her body tensing instinctively. Her voice was firm but cracking. My children are healthy. They're loved. Frank sneered, his words slicing the air. Sleeping under concrete doesn't count as care. They need a real home, not this. Hope, who had been drawing in the dirt nearby, ran to her mother's side. Her eyes were wide with fear, her voice shaking. Mommy, are they going to take us away? Susan knelt down with a sugary tone. Sweetheart, we just want you to have a better life, a safe house, loving parents. Don't you want that for your brother? Hope straightened her back, her tiny fists clenched. We already have that. We have Mommy. We have Kevin. We have Mr. Thomas. We're a family. Frank let out a low, mocking laugh. You mean that rich guy who drops off food like a charity project? He'll disappear just like they all do. He doesn't care about people like you. What Frank didn't know, what he could never have guessed, was that every sneer, every threat, every word he uttered was being captured on hidden high-definition cameras. Installed days earlier by Thomas's team, they recorded every minute from multiple angles. More importantly, Frank had just made the catastrophic mistake of underestimating the man he had mocked. That night, Thomas sat alone in his office reviewing the footage. He watched Frank dismiss Hope, intimidate Fiona, and refer to children as inventory. It wasn't anger that rose in him. It was precision, controlled methodical fury. At 11 o'clock, he picked up the phone. Hillary, he said, first thing tomorrow, I want you to file the federal complaint. Human trafficking, corruption, civil rights abuse, the full weight of it. And the family, she asked. Frank might lash out when he realizes he's been exposed. Thomas looked out across the dark city. They'll be safe, because tomorrow they're moving into my home. There was a pause. Are you sure that could complicate the case? Hillary, I'm not asking. I'm telling you. His tone was final, not angry, not impulsive, just resolute, the voice of a man who had been pushed to his limit and chosen his side. The war had begun, and Frank had just become the first casualty. The next morning, Thomas Rivera arrived at the overpass just as the early sun began to warm the steel beams overhead. The air was brisk, the kind that made you tighten your coat a little closer and breathe in slow to soften the sting. With him came 2 lawyers, Hillary Bernard's trusted associates, walking with the calm purpose of people used to confronting chaos. Behind them, a large moving truck idled quietly at the curb, its engine a low hum beneath the distant drone of traffic. Tucked under Thomas's arm were temporary guardianship papers, carefully reviewed, notarized, and ready. Fiona stood beside the makeshift shelter with Kevin in her arms, confusion etched deep into her expression as she watched Thomas approach with such formal reinforcements. Hope clung to her side, her brows pinched in worry. Mr. Rivera, we can't accept this, Fiona said, her voice soft but firm. It's too much. Fiona Thomas interrupted gently, crouching slightly to meet her eye level, his voice steady, unwavering. In 48 hours, Officer Frank will realize he went after the wrong family. When that moment comes, you can't be here. You need to be somewhere safe. Hope, her small fingers tugging gently at Thomas's coat, looked up at him with an expression far too solemn for a 6-year-old. Mr. Thomas, she whispered, will you really protect us from the bad man? He knelt down, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. Hope, do you trust me? She nodded. Yes. Then believe me when I say the bad man will never hurt you again. Not you, not your brother, not your mom, not anyone." Fiona stood still, watching the exchange. There was something new in Thomas's eyes, an intensity she hadn't seen before. It was comforting, yes, but also quietly terrifying. This wasn't just a businessman showing compassion anymore. It was something deeper, something more permanent. As Fiona Hope and Kevin gathered their few belongings, packing what little they had into battered plastic bags and dented totes, Thomas's phone buzzed. A message from Ben Carter. "Vance just posted in the group, says he got 2 more products ready for pickup. He still thinks he's winning." Thomas typed back without hesitation. "Let him. Tomorrow he'll learn the difference between bullying families with nothing and picking a fight with someone who has everything." Cradling Kevin gently in his arms as they approached the waiting car, Thomas glanced back once at the spot beneath the overpass. Strange, he thought, how life had rerouted itself because of a little girl who had once asked for milk in the middle of the night. Looking at Hope now clutching her mother's hand, face tilted to the sky, he knew he wouldn't change a thing. Officer Frank had made one critical mistake. He hadn't just provoked a wealthy man. He had awakened a father. 2 mornings later, Officer Frank awoke with no idea the ground beneath him was about to collapse. To him, it was another routine day, another checklist of families to push out, another hour of cruelty cloaked in duty. At 8 o'clock sharp, his phone rang. Captain Morrison's voice was unusually tense. "Frank, get to the station. Now. We've got a situation." At the precinct, Frank strode in confidently, only to stop cold in the doorway of the captain's office. Inside stood 3 internal affairs officers, 2 federal agents, and seated calmly at the end of the table, Hillary Bernard herself. Her reputation preceded her, and Frank knew it. His mouth went dry. Officer Frank Morrison began tone-stripped of familiarity. "Do you know who this is?" Frank nodded stiffly. "Yes." Hillary powered on a tablet and turned the screen toward him. "Do you recognize these recordings?" His face drained of color. There, in vivid high definition, he watched himself dousing Fiona's meager belongings with ice water, his own voice shouting threats, mocking a crying child. The audio was painfully clear, each cruel word undeniable. "Where did you get this?" He blurted louder than intended. "Public security footage," Hillary replied coolly. "All legally obtained. But that's just the beginning." She swiped to another clip. This time, group messages, digital receipts of banter between officers, bets placed on how many families could be removed, children casually referred to as premium products. Frank's name featured prominently. "You terrorized 52 families over 18 months, said Agent Thompson, stepping forward. "We're investigating human trafficking, extortion, civil rights violations. Your name is at the center." Frank's knees wavered. "Human trafficking, I didn't." Hillary cut him off, playing a final audio file. His own voice filled the room. "I got 2 more premium products lined up. The girl's 6. Perfect for those rich folks who want small ones. The boy's usable too." "Premium products." Hillary's tone was razor sharp. "Is that how you refer to children?" Captain Morrison shook his head, eyes heavy with disappointment. 23 years on the force, Frank. How the hell did it come to this?" Officer Frank sat motionless, his mouth dry, heart pounding against the walls of his chest. The air in the room had turned thick, unbreathable. Sweat clung to his brow, and for the first time in years, he couldn't hide behind his uniform. He could barely process what Hillary Bernard had just laid before him, screenshot after screenshot of messages from a supposedly secure channel exposing bets jokes and sinister commentary between officers about how many homeless families they could remove from city streets by Friday. "But you cannot clear 5 bums by Friday." Hillary read her voice, slicing through the silence, deliberately emphasizing the dehumanizing language. I separated 2 kids yesterday. Double commission this month." A hush fell over the room, so absolute it seemed to swallow the air. Everyone present, federal agents, internal affairs investigators, the police captain, watched Officer Frank silently disintegrate. His carefully constructed facade of authority and control was crumbling before their eyes. His fingers trembled slightly as they gripped the edge of the chair. This wasn't just a suspension. This was the beginning of the end. "Who's behind this?" Agent Thompson asked, his voice level but edged with urgency. "Because we know you didn't pull this off alone." Frank looked around as if searching for an escape route that no longer existed. He opened his mouth, but before he could speak, Hillary tapped her tablet again, playing another damning recording. Frank's voice crackled through the speakers, speaking freely and with no trace of caution about orders from above and the Crescent Bay project. Hillary's expression turned steely. "Crescent Bay Holdings," she said, clearly, her gaze fixed on Frank. $16 million in fraudulent municipal contracts. You used psychological intimidation to drive families out. Then Crescent Bay bought up the land for pennies. Agent Thompson leaned forward and placed a small tape recorder on the table. "Officer Frank, you have the right to an attorney, but if you begin cooperating now, it could affect how we proceed." The door to the captain's office opened slowly, and Thomas Rivera walked in. He was impeccably dressed in a dark tailored suit, briefcase in hand. There was nothing hurried or flamboyant about his entrance, just a man who had come to finish what he started. "Apologies for the delay," Thomas said, his tone calm and deliberate. His eyes moved slowly across the room, then landed on Officer Frank. "I was reviewing the final pieces of evidence." Frank stiffened in his seat. A tremor of disbelief washed over him. You were behind this. You've been documenting everything." Thomas opened the briefcase and placed a folder on the table with deliberate care. "Every crime, every conversation, every deal, including this meeting where your superiors at Crescent Bay discuss how to use officers like you two and, I quote, clean up problem zones before acquisition." Thomas pressed play on a small device, and the voice of Crescent Bay's CEO filled the room. "The key is it has to look legal. Frank knows how to push these families out without leaving any trace on the books." Frank slumped back into his chair. The walls were closing in. This wasn't just police brutality. It was systemic corruption tied to millions of dollars in illegal profits. "Mr. Rivera," Agent Thompson said, visibly impressed, "could you clarify your role in this case?" Thomas didn't look away from Frank. He spoke evenly, without any trace of bravado. "When I saw Officer Frank threaten a 6-year-old girl and her family people, I now consider my own, I made a decision. I used every tool I had to find out who was behind it." Hillary nodded. "Mr. Rivera funded a 6-month covert investigation. We uncovered more than $50 million in misappropriated funds, all flowing through Crescent Bay and aided by police misconduct." Frank's lips parted slightly, but no words came. Everything, his pension, his badge, his legacy, was gone. And it wasn't taken by an angry activist or an underdog. It was taken by a man with resources, reach, and righteous fury. Thomas walked slowly around the table and stopped directly across from Frank. "Do you remember what you said to Hope that day under the bridge, that men like me get tired of people like her?" Frank gave a weak nod. "You were right. I got tired. Tired of watching innocent families get threatened and destroyed. Tired of seeing children treated like problems to be cleared." He placed another set of documents on the table. Bank statements, offshore transfers, a paper trail spanning 3 years. "You and your team turned a child protection system into a human trafficking machine, and I have everything." Captain Morrison rose his jaw tight with restrained fury. His voice was flat, but his words were devastating. "Officer Frank, you are hereby suspended without pay. You will be formally charged with extortion, human trafficking, corruption, and systematic civil rights violations." Frank tried to respond, but all that escaped was a broken whisper. How did you find all this?" Thomas stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to ensure Frank heard every word. "Because you underestimated the people you hurt, and you misjudged me. You thought I was just a sentimental businessman." Hillary's voice cut through the silence. "Mr. Rivera has a team of 15 attorneys, investigators in 3 states, and $200 million at his disposal. You chose the wrong fight." As Frank was led out of the room in handcuffs, wrists bound tightly behind his back, Agent Thompson turned toward Thomas. "Mr. Rivera," he said, "if you have more evidence on the Crescent Bay officers or the misuse of public housing funds." Thomas gave a small, solemn nod. "I do, and I'll make sure every last one of them answers for what they've done." That afternoon, while headlines blazed across television screens and news sites about the largest anti-corruption operation in city history, Thomas Rivera stood in the middle of his sunlit garden, watching something far more meaningful unfold. Hope was kneeling on the grass beside Kevin, gently guiding his small hand across a sheet of paper. With childlike patience and concentration, she was teaching him how to draw flowers. The afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting a warm golden hue over the green lawn. The scent of jasmine lingered faintly in the air, mixing with the earthy aroma of freshly turned soil from Fiona's garden beds. Thomas stood nearby, arms crossed gently over his chest, a faint smile on his face. The day was calm, unusually, so no phones ringing, no meetings, no strategies, just peace. Hope looked up from her colorful sketch eyes, wide with curiosity, and something heavier beneath. "Mr. Thomas," she asked, her voice filled with tentative hope. "Will the bad man never bother anyone again?" Thomas took a breath, feeling the question land like a stone in still water. He knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Never again, sweetheart," he said quietly. "Not him, and not the people who told him to do bad things." Fiona walked over then, holding a mug that sent up soft tendrils of steam into the air. Her steps were light, but the gratitude in her eyes was weighted and sincere. "Thomas, I don't know how to thank you," she said, handing him the cup. He took it but shook his head slowly. "You don't have to thank me for protecting my family," he replied, looking at her, not just as someone he helped, but as someone who had changed him. Hope had been listening. Her brow creased, and she turned to look up at him again. "Are we really your family?" Thomas smiled. He crouched down lower, wrapped an arm around her shoulders, and held her gently. "You're the only real family I've ever had," he said, and the words came out with a finality that surprised even him. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting amber light across the cityscape beyond his property, Thomas sat back and let the moment settle. It was astonishing how a single question from a little girl asking for milk in the middle of the night had reshaped everything. In a life once ruled by profit margins and legal loopholes, Hope had introduced something utterly foreign and completely indispensable. Love without transaction, loyalty without contract, family not by blood but by choice. And that was the thing. When someone dares to threaten the people you've chosen as your own, you don't negotiate. You protect, with everything. 6 months passed. One morning, Thomas woke early, the soft chirping of birds just beginning to rise. From his bedroom window, he could see the garden bathed in soft morning light. Laughter echoed through the space, clear, joyful, unburdened. Hope was out on the lawn, guiding Kevin's tentative steps across the dewy grass. Fiona nearby was kneeling by a flower bed, planting marigolds in neat rows, her movements precise and gentle. Daddy Thomas Hope called out, spotting him in the doorway. She ran to him without hesitation. The word "daddy" still made his heart skip. Every time. It caught him off guard, not because it felt undeserved, but because it felt healing. Fiona looked up and smiled. "She's insisted on calling you that ever since you signed the adoption papers," she said, brushing dirt off her palms. Thomas crouched, opened his arms, and caught Hope in a firm, affectionate hug. "And I insist that it's the most beautiful word I've ever heard," he whispered into her hair. Across town, Officer Frank Vance sat in a prison cell. The walls were cold, the cot unforgiving, the silence sometimes unbearable. His sentence, 15 years. Human trafficking, corruption, civil rights violations. He had tried at first to understand how things had unraveled so quickly, how a man he once dismissed as a sentimental fool had dismantled everything he'd built in mere weeks. Now, surrounded by the echoes of families he'd torn apart with some of those very children now in foster care, Vance began to realize something: power without conscience always invites ruin. The name Thomas Rivera, once an afterthought, now echoed like a sentence in his mind. Crescent Bay Holdings didn't fare much better. Their contracts were terminated. $120 million in fines followed. And every executive involved learned that exploiting suffering might make you money, but it never makes you safe. Back in the Rivera home that afternoon, the kitchen smelled of roasted vegetables and warm bread. Hope stood on a step stool at the counter, her small hands carefully folding napkins while Thomas chopped tomatoes. Thomas, she began the words thoughtful. "My teacher asked me what I want to be when I grow up." Thomas paused his cutting. "And what did you tell her?" "My princess. I said, I want to help other families like ours. Families people pretend not to see." He looked at her, really looked at her, 6 years old, and already carrying more insight than many adults he'd known. A tightness rose in his throat. "You know you can be anything you want to be, right?" "Yes," she said confidently. "But I want to be like you, someone who uses his power to protect people." Fiona, seated at the table feeding Kevin his mashed carrots, looked up. Her expression was soft, radiant. "She's right, Thomas," she said. "You showed us that family isn't about who you're born to. It's about who you stand by, who you choose to love." Thomas nodded, and as the sun set again on a life he never expected but would never give up, he realized one thing with certainty. This was never about charity. It was about justice. And justice, when guided by love, doesn't just punish the wicked, it rebuilds what they tried to destroy. That night, as Thomas Rivera gently tucked Hope into bed, the room around them glowed softly under the warm light of a bedside lamp. Her walls, once bare and cold, were now alive with color crayon drawings taped along the edge of her shelf, stories scribbled in a child's hand, and books carefully lined up on a low wooden rack. A quiet hum of night sounds drifted in through the slightly open window, the distant chirp of crickets, the gentle rustling of trees. Hope lay under a thick quilt patterned with stars, her small hand reaching for Thomas's fingers. "Daddy Thomas," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath, the drowsiness tugging at her eyelids. "Thank you for choosing us as your family." Thomas swallowed, his chest tightening in that familiar, overwhelming way it always did when Hope called him that. "Thank you," he murmured, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead, "for teaching me what family really means, my princess." 6 months had passed since Officer Frank's trial ended, and the city had begun picking up the pieces. One chilly fall morning, Thomas received a call that stopped him in his tracks. It was from the mayor's office. The voice on the other end was warm, reverent. "Mr. Rivera, we'd like to invite you to spearhead a municipal family protection program. Something permanent, something real." Thomas didn't need to think. "I accept," he said at once. But then he paused just long enough to make sure his next words landed clearly. "But I have one condition." "What's that?" the mayor asked. "I want Hope to cut the ribbon at the opening ceremony, because she taught me that protecting families isn't charity. It's a duty, a responsibility we all share." And so, on a crisp morning in early spring, the city gathered at the site of the new Family Resource Center. The sun was high, casting golden light on the brick walls of what would soon be known as Hope's Haven. Hundreds of people stood watching, many holding signs of gratitude, others simply holding hands. At the center of the crowd, Hope stood poised with a giant pair of red ribbon-cutting scissors, nearly half her size. Her little brother Kevin sat quietly in Thomas's lap at the back, wrapped in a blue sweater. Elena stood beside Hope, holding her daughter's free hand tightly. Mommy Hope whispered, her voice trembling not from fear, but from awe. "Are we helping other families not go through what we went through?" Elena's voice wavered, tears catching in her throat. "We are, my princess. And it's all because you were brave enough to ask for help from someone who could do something." At that moment, as the ribbon fluttered to the ground and applause filled the courtyard, cameras caught Thomas discreetly wiping tears from his eyes. And in that brief second, everyone watching, those present and those tuning in on television, understood this wasn't a story about a rich man saving a poor family. It was about a little girl saving a man who had spent decades lost in the pursuit of the wrong kind of wealth. Meanwhile, Officer Frank sat in a dim prison rec room, the volume on the wall-mounted television turned up just enough for the news anchor's voice to echo clearly. When he saw Hope smiling on that stage and Thomas Rivera clapping in the background, something inside him finally gave way. It wasn't anger, it was a realization. He had gambled everything on fear, on cruelty, on greed, and lost. Because sometimes the people you think are powerless turn out to have the kind of strength you never imagined. Thomas now knew with absolute clarity, true wealth wasn't in the boardroom or in offshore accounts. It was in Hope's laughter as it echoed through their sunlit backyard, in the feel of Kevin's tiny arms wrapped around his neck, in the word Daddy yelled across the house with joy. It was in belonging, in knowing that no matter how long or hard the day, someone would be waiting to run into your arms. And Hope, she carried her own quiet truth, that sometimes when you're brave enough to ask for help, you receive more than you ever thought possible. The milk she had once begged for had been paid back 1,000 times over. She hadn't just been given what she needed. She had given something far greater in return, the transformation of a man's life. She had reminded the world that family once chosen is the only wealth that grows endlessly the more you give it away. That night, as Thomas Rivera gently tucked Hope into bed, the room around them glowed softly under the warm light of a bedside lamp. Her walls, once bare and cold, were now alive with color crayon drawings taped along the edge of her shelf, stories scribbled in a child's hand, and books carefully lined up on a low wooden rack. A quiet hum of night sounds drifted in through the slightly open window, the distant chirp of crickets, the gentle rustling of trees. Hope lay under a thick quilt patterned with stars, her small hand reaching for Thomas's fingers. "Daddy Thomas," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath, the drowsiness tugging at her eyelids. "Thank you for choosing us as your family." Thomas swallowed, his chest tightening in that familiar, overwhelming way it always did when Hope called him that. "Thank you," he murmured, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead, "for teaching me what family really means, my princess." 6 months had passed since Officer Frank's trial ended, and the city had begun picking up the pieces. One chilly fall morning, Thomas received a call that stopped him in his tracks. It was from the mayor's office. The voice on the other end was warm, reverent. "Mr. Rivera, we'd like to invite you to spearhead a municipal family protection program. Something permanent. Something real." Thomas didn't need to think. "I accept," he said at once. But then he paused just long enough to make sure his next words landed clearly. "But I have one condition." "What's that?" the mayor asked. "I want Hope to cut the ribbon at the opening ceremony, because she taught me that protecting families isn't charity. It's a duty. A responsibility we all share." And so, on a crisp morning in early spring, the city gathered at the site of the new Family Resource Center. The sun was high, casting golden light on the brick walls of what would soon be known as Hope's Haven. Hundreds of people stood watching, many holding signs of gratitude, others simply holding hands. At the center of the crowd, Hope stood poised with a giant pair of red ribbon-cutting scissors nearly half her size. Her little brother Kevin sat quietly in Thomas's lap at the back, wrapped in a blue sweater. Elena stood beside Hope, holding her daughter's free hand tightly. Mommy Hope whispered, her voice trembling, not from fear, but from awe. "Are we helping other families not go through what we went through?" Elena's voice wavered, tears catching in her throat. "We are, my princess. And it's all because you were brave enough to ask for help from someone who could do something." At that moment, as the ribbon fluttered to the ground and applause filled the courtyard, cameras caught Thomas discreetly wiping tears from his eyes. And in that brief second, everyone watching, those present and those tuning in on television, understood this wasn't a story about a rich man saving a poor family. It was about a little girl saving a man who had spent decades lost in the pursuit of the wrong kind of wealth. Meanwhile, Officer Frank sat in a dim prison rec room, the volume on the wall-mounted television turned up just enough for the news anchor's voice to echo clearly. When he saw Hope smiling on that stage and Thomas Rivera clapping in the background, something inside him finally gave way. It wasn't anger, it was realization. He had gambled everything on fear, on cruelty, on greed, and lost. Because sometimes the people you think are powerless turn out to have the kind of strength you never imagined. Thomas now knew with absolute clarity, true wealth wasn't in the boardroom or in offshore accounts. It was in Hope's laughter as it echoed through their sunlit backyard, in the feel of Kevin's tiny arms wrapped around his neck, in the word Daddy yelled across the house with joy. It was in belonging, in knowing that no matter how long or hard the day, someone would be waiting to run into your arms. And Hope, she carried her own quiet truth, that sometimes when you're brave enough to ask for help, you receive more than you ever thought possible. The milk she had once begged for had been paid back 1,000 times over. She hadn't just been given what she needed, she had given something far greater in return, the transformation of a man's life. She had reminded the world that family once chosen is the only wealth that grows endlessly the more you give it away. And so life unfolded with a kind of steady warmth that Thomas Rivera had never quite known before. Mornings began not with headlines about markets or calls from his legal team, but with the soft shuffle of small feet on hardwood floors and the chirp of birds outside their window-lined kitchen. Hope, now a confident 6-year-old with a spark in her eyes and a stubborn sense of right and wrong, had taken to helping Fiona pack lunches for local shelters every Saturday. It was her idea, after all, she reasoned. If someone helped us, then someone might need us next. Kevin, now sturdier on his feet, babbled with increasing clarity, clinging to his older sister with admiration in his every glance. Thomas often paused in the hallway just to listen to them laugh or watch them scribble over the kitchen table, their crayons scattered across the surface like confetti left over from some small celebration of life. The house, once filled only with expensive furniture, in silence, now hummed with activity. Fiona had found a job helping coordinate outreach efforts through Hope's Haven, the new Family Resource Center that now bore their story in every hallway and every mural. But more importantly, she had found peace. Her posture had changed, less guarded, more at ease, and she smiled more freely now, her eyes softening each time she glanced at her children or caught Thomas watching them from across the room. There were moments brief but powerful when she would stop mid-task, hand resting gently on Kevin's back or on the edge of a windowsill, and simply breathe. Those were the moments she never thought she'd live, to see moments that felt safe, unhurried, and hers to keep. Evenings became a ritual. Thomas would leave the office by 5, no matter what something his staff had learned not to challenge. Dinner was never rushed. Conversations ranged from Kevin's newfound obsession with bugs to Hope's opinions on how school rules were sometimes unfair to quiet kids. Fiona listened, laughed, and chimed in with updates from the center, often stories that broke Thomas's heart and reminded him of how much work remained. But the heaviness was shared now. He didn't carry it alone. After the table was cleared, bedtime brought a slower, softer rhythm, bathwater running tiny feet, kicking under blankets, and always, without fail, a story read aloud by Thomas. Sometimes it was a fairy tale. Sometimes it was a poem Hope had written. Sometimes it was simply quiet words exchanged in the dark promises that no matter what came next, they were together. Outside their home, change was taking root too. The scandal that had rocked the city continued to ripple outward. Officer Frank's conviction had opened investigations into other precincts, and more families were coming forward, mothers who had been silenced, children who had disappeared into the system. With the weight of Hillary Bernard's legal work and Thomas's funding, Hope's Haven became more than a center. It became a movement. Policies were revised. City officials were replaced. And slowly the system began to tilt, not yet perfectly, but meaningfully toward compassion and accountability. Hillary often visited for planning sessions, and though her demeanor remained stern, even she cracked a smile when Kevin would toddle into the room, sticky-handed and giggling. One fall afternoon, as golden leaves drifted across the backyard, Thomas found himself sitting on the porch steps, a mug of tea warming his hands. Hope joined him, settling beside him with the casual ease of a child who knew she belonged. She leaned her head on his arm, her curls brushing against his sleeve. "Daddy Thomas," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "when I grow up, I want to build places like this one. Not just for kids like me, but for moms who are scared, so they have somewhere safe." Thomas's throat tightened. He reached for her hand, still so small in his. "That's a beautiful dream, sweetheart," he said, his voice low. "And I'll help you every step of the way." Hope tilted her face toward his, her expression earnest. "Do you think it'll really change things? Like for real?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out over the yard, watched Fiona through the window as she coaxed Kevin into a sweater too big for him, and then turned back to his daughter. "Yes," he said finally, "because it already has." Hope didn't say anything else. She just leaned into him, the weight of her body, a gentle reminder of everything he'd gained the moment he'd chosen to help a stranger under an overpass. For Thomas, this was no longer a second chance. It was the life he was always meant to have. Later that winter, a journalist from a national magazine came to profile the story. She sat at their kitchen table recorder, running, asking questions in the quiet tone of someone trying not to disturb the fragile, sacred thing unfolding in front of her. She asked Fiona what it was like to trust again. She asked Thomas what had changed in him. But it was Hope who gave the most honest answer, spoken with the kind of clarity only children possess. "When people forget what love looks like," she said, her legs swinging from the kitchen chair, "you just have to remind them." And in that moment, Thomas realized something he hadn't yet put into words. Hope hadn't just changed his path. She had recalibrated his moral compass. Everything he did now, every meeting, every investment, every new initiative was viewed through the lens of one question. Would this help the next child like her? It wasn't charity. It was clarity. And it made him more focused, more fulfilled, more dangerous to the kind of cruelty that had once gone unchecked. Years would pass. Kevin would grow up tall and kind-hearted, with a quiet resilience and a protective streak, just like his sisters. Hope would lead school projects, organize drives, and eventually apply to colleges with programs focused on social justice. Fiona would expand Hope's Haven into multiple locations, her face now familiar to the press and the public alike. And Thomas, he would age with a sense of peace that eluded him in his younger days. Not because life became simple, but because it finally made sense. On the 10th anniversary of Hope's Haven, Thomas stood at the podium, older now, grayer at the temples, but with a steadiness in his voice that held the room silent. Hope stood beside him, no longer a little girl, but a poised young woman, smiling with quiet pride. "I used to think success was what you earned," he told the crowd, "but it's not. Success is what you protect. It's the people you lift, the voices you help others hear. I didn't rescue anyone. They rescued me." He paused, scanning the audience until his gaze found Fiona and Kevin in the front row, and then Hope beside him. "And I would do it all over again," he said, without hesitation, "because no amount of money, no corner office, no accolade in the world compares to this, to them, to us." As the crowd stood in applause, Thomas looked at Hope, eyes misted but steady, and whispered, "You were right, Princess. Love is what changes the world." Hope reached for his hand, her fingers curling around his. "I only learned that because someone showed me first." And in that moment, with flashbulbs capturing the soft light on their faces and a room full of witnesses who had followed every chapter of their journey, the story came full circle. It wasn't a fairy tale, and it didn't need to be. It was real. It was earned. And it was still unfolding, with every family helped, every child seen, every voice protected. The ending wasn't really an ending at all. It was just the beginning of a life chosen, built, and shared with love. And now, as this chapter gently draws to a close, we want to say thank you truly. If you're still here, still listening, still feeling this story deep in your chest, that means it mattered. And that matters to us more than we can say. This wasn't just a story about overcoming hardship. It was about justice, about family, about how one act of kindness, one voice that refuses to be ignored, can ripple through lives and systems and change everything. We told this story not to sensationalize suffering, but to honor it, to show what happens when people rise above prejudice and bias and choose love over apathy. Stories like this, Black stories, real-life stories, powerful lessons born from adversity, remind us why empathy is not weakness. It's strength, it's survival, and it's how we build something better. If this touched you, if it made you think, cry, or simply sit in silence for a moment, please let us know. Drop a comment and share where you're watching from. Was it Hope's courage that stayed with you, Thomas's transformation, Fiona's resilience? We'd love to hear what spoke to you most. And if you believe in stories that move us, challenge us, inspire us to be better, consider leaving a like-hitting subscribe and staying with us for the journeys ahead. Your support allows us to keep telling these emotional stories, these inspiring life stories about fairness, about redemption, about choosing to fight for someone else when the world has forgotten them. Thank you for being part of this one. We'll see you in the next. Until then, take care, and remember, love isn't a miracle, it's a choice, and it's ours to make every single day.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.